James Holloway's fingers tightened around the crumpled eviction notice, the damp paper sticking to his calloused hands as the ink bled into the creases. Rain fell in heavy sheets, dripping from the brim of his worn-out hat, soaking his flannel shirt. He barely felt it. His eyes remained fixed on the retreating figure of the county officer, his boots squelching in the mud as he walked back to his car. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the puddles in the dirt driveway, casting eerie streaks of color across the farmhouse's peeling white paint. The land was no longer his. James stood motionless, the words on the paper blurring together. The farm his grandfather had built, the soil his father had bled for, the fields James had worked since he was old enough to hold a shovel. All of it was being taken away. It wasn't just land. It was his life. The developers had won. The offer had come months ago, a neatly typed letter from some corporate real estate firm promising a generous compensation package. James hadn't even opened it before tossing it into the fire. He knew what they wanted: to bulldoze the farm, to level the fields, to cover the earth with concrete and asphalt, just another shopping plaza or a row of overpriced luxury villas. He'd fought it. He'd stood in front of the town council, hands trembling with barely contained rage, demanding that they see reason. But they hadn't. They saw numbers, profits, expansion. He was just a farmer to them. The final blow had come days ago in the form of a cold, impersonal notice. The land had been sold, the purchase finalized without his consent. Apparently, buried in the old records, some loophole had allowed the developers to claim it. He had 60 days. 60 days to pack up generations of memories, to tear apart the home his father had built with his own hands. 60 days before the demolition crews arrived. Now, standing alone in the downpour, James finally let the weight of it sink in. His father had come back from Vietnam to fight for this farm, to protect the land that had been in their family for generations. And now, James was powerless to stop history from being buried beneath steel and glass. That night, he sat on the creaky wooden porch, an old whiskey bottle in one hand, the eviction notice in the other. The rain had stopped, but the storm hadn't left. It gathered in the distance, thunder rolling low and deep across the fields. He stared out at the land, the corn stalks swaying gently in the wind, the familiar scent of earth and rain filling his lungs. His father's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if the old man were sitting beside him. Holloway's never backed down. But what was left to fight for? James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Maybe it was time to let go. Maybe there was nothing left to save. Then he heard it, a deep, low rumble that wasn't thunder. It started as a distant vibration, rolling over the fields like the approach of a storm, but it didn't fade. It grew louder, stronger. James sat up, the bottle forgotten. His eyes scanned the horizon. The wind picked up, rustling the crops, sending a chill down his spine. Then in the distance, lights. Blinding white beams cut through the darkness, growing larger, closer, illuminating the treetops and casting long shadows across the field. James's breath caught in his throat. The rumble became a deafening roar. The wind howled, whipping against his face, his shirt flapping violently against his skin. And then he saw it, a massive black silhouette descending from the sky, the unmistakable form of an Apache helicopter. Not passing overhead, landing right in the middle of his field. James bolted to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He shielded his face as the powerful rotor wash sent dirt spiraling into the air, the force of it nearly knocking him backward. The ground shook beneath his boots as the aircraft settled onto his land, the roar of its engine slowly winding down to a steady, pulsing hum. He barely had time to react before the side door swung open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his military fatigues crisp despite the wind tearing through the field. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as if he belonged here, as if he had already claimed this land as his own. James's pulse thundered in his ears. Who was he? Why was he here? And what did this mean for his land? James took an instinctive step back as the man in fatigues approached, his boots crunching against the damp earth. The night was eerily still now. the deafening roar of the helicopter replaced by the steady hum of its idling engine. The man's posture was rigid, his movements calculated, his eyes scanning the land as though confirming something before locking onto James with an unsettling precision. "James Holloway," the man called, his voice steady, authoritative. James swallowed hard. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Who's asking?" The man stopped a few paces away, studying him for a moment before reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded document and extended it forward. "You're going to want to read this." James hesitated. Even in the dim moonlight, he could make out the insignia stamped at the top, the emblem of the United States Department of Defense. His stomach tightened. This wasn't some local government notice. This was something else entirely. Slowly, he reached out and took it, his rough, calloused fingers brushing over the embossed seal. The chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the night air. He looked back up at the man before him, taking him in fully now. He wasn't just some low-ranking officer. He carried himself with a presence that demanded attention. His uniform was crisp despite the wind, his face lined with the kind of wear that only came from years of knowing things other men didn't. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice harder now. "Colonel Richard Marshall," the man answered, slipping his hands behind his back. "United States Army, retired." James felt his pulse quicken. The name wasn't familiar, but something about the way he said it made it clear. This wasn't a social call. "What the hell does the military want with my farm?" Marshall's expression didn't change. "You don't know, do you?" James narrowed his eyes. "Know what?" A long pause. Then Marshall took a measured breath before speaking again. "This land, your land, was never just a farm. It was once a classified military installation." James let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible." Marshall's gaze remained steady. "Your father never told you, did he?" James opened his mouth, ready to protest, but something about the way Marshall said it made him stop short. The words struck something deep inside him. "My father never mentioned anything about," because he wasn't allowed to. James stiffened. "That's a lie." Marshall reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a worn, leather-bound folder. He flipped it open and turned it toward James, revealing a grainy black-and-white photograph clipped to the top page. James stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The photo was old, the edges curled with time. In it stood a younger version of his father, dressed in military fatigues, standing beside another man, Marshall. James's knees went weak. His father looked different, more rigid, serious, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap. He wasn't just some farmer in this photo. He was a man with purpose, standing next to soldiers, looking at ease among them. James tore his eyes away from the picture and flipped through the rest of the documents. Maps, aerial surveillance images, schematics of underground tunnels, official government seals stamped across faded pages. And then, at the top of one of the reports, bold red letters. Classified, Project Falcon. James swallowed hard. "No, that doesn't make sense. My father, he wasn't some government agent. He was just a farmer." Marshall closed the folder and held James's gaze. "No, he wasn't. He was brought in as a civilian contractor. The government needed someone they could trust, someone who knew the land, who could maintain the site while keeping it hidden." Your father agreed. James's mind spun. His father had worked this land his entire life. He had taught James how to plant, how to harvest, how to fix a broken fence with nothing but wire and sheer determination. But this was something else. He took a step back, shaking his head. "This has to be a mistake. If this place was some kind of secret base, we would have known." Marshall exhaled. "Your father made sure you wouldn't." James clenched his jaw, frustration rising like a wildfire inside him. Why? Why keep something like this from me?" "Because he was protecting you." James scoffed. "Protecting me from what?" Marshall's expression darkened. "From the people who are trying to take it now." The words hit James like a hammer to the chest. "The developers." Marshall nodded. "They're not just real estate moguls. The company trying to buy your land is a front, backed by foreign interests. We've been watching them for years. They're after something buried here. Something important enough that they're willing to go to great lengths to get it." James stared at him, his fists clenching. You're saying they know about the old base? We believe they do. And if we don't stop them, your family's land, and potentially national security, could end up in the wrong hands. A cold dread settled over James. He turned, looking out at the fields, the same land he had walked as a child, played in, worked tirelessly to keep alive. And beneath it all, there was a secret his father had died protecting. He turned back to Marshall, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. What exactly is buried here? Marshall hesitated, his gaze unreadable. We don't know, he admitted. Not yet. James exhaled sharply. This was too much. Too sudden. Just hours ago, he was a man with nothing. No options, no future. Now he had a choice. And if what Marshall was saying was true, then this fight wasn't just about a farm anymore. James felt his breath come in sharp, ragged bursts, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the revelation. The land he had spent his entire life working, the soil his father had tilled, the fields his grandfather had once called home, it had never been just a farm. It had been something else entirely. Something hidden, something dangerous. And now it was slipping through his fingers. His grip tightened around the folder Marshall had given him, the worn edges of the documents pressing into his palm. His father had kept this secret his entire life, had protected it with everything he had, and now James was supposed to just stand by and let a group of foreign-backed developers take it, turn it into parking lots and shopping centers, while whatever was buried beneath his feet fell into the wrong hands? No. James clenched his jaw, his voice like steel. I won't let them take this. Marshall studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he nodded. Good, he said, because we may have a way to stop them. James narrowed his eyes. Ow! Marshall exhaled, taking a step closer. Right now, the developers have the legal upper hand. On paper, they own this land. But if we can prove that it's still critical to national security, the government has the right to step in and reclaim it. James frowned. You mean eminent domain? Marshall nodded. Specifically, under Executive Order 11,905, the National Security Protection Act. It allows the government to override private ownership if the property is deemed essential to national defense. James let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. So, you're telling me the same government that let my land get stolen in the first place is now going to swoop in and save it? Forgive me if I don't exactly trust that plan. Marshall's gaze remained steady. I don't blame you. Bureaucracy buried this site decades ago. Mistakes were made. But we have one advantage now that we didn't before. James folded his arms. And what's that? Marshall smirked. You. James blinked. Me? You know this land better than anyone, Marshall said. You know every inch of it. Every tree, every fence post, every odd patch of soil. If something was buried here, something important, your father would have found a way to mark it. And if we can find that proof, we can use it to take this land back. James's stomach twisted. His father. He had spent his whole life working alongside the man, learning from him, watching him. How many times had his father paused in the middle of their work, staring out at the fields as if lost in thought? How many times had James caught him up late at night, walking the land alone, tracing the edges of the property in a way that had never quite made sense? Had he known that one day, James would need to follow those same steps? James swallowed hard. Let's say we do find something. What happens then? Marshall's expression darkened. Then we make sure the developers never get their hands on it. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This was insane. Just hours ago, he had been preparing to lose everything. Now he was being asked to go to war over land that, for all he knew, had been hiding secrets longer than he had been alive. But deep down, he already knew his answer. His father hadn't backed down. Neither would he. James met Marshall's gaze, his voice steady. All right, he said. Tell me what I need to do. The next morning, the sun rose over James Holloway's farm, casting long shadows over the fields that had become a battleground, not just for his family's history, but for something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The world still looked the same, but everything had changed. By midday, the first wave of military specialists arrived, their vehicles kicking up dust as they rolled down the dirt road that led to the farmhouse. Men in dark fatigues unloaded equipment James couldn't begin to name. Devices with screens flickering with green lines, scanners that pulsed as they swept the earth, instruments designed to see through the very land beneath his feet. James stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching as they worked. "You're awfully quiet," Marshall said, stepping up beside him. James exhaled through his nose. "Just trying to wrap my head around it. My whole life, I thought this place was just a farm. Turns out it's sitting on top of what exactly?" Marshall glanced toward the specialists, who were setting up near a section of the field where the ground sloped just slightly, a spot James's father had always been strangely protective of. "We don't know yet, but we're about to find out." The lead technician signaled, and Marshall gave a nod. A handheld scanner was placed against the ground, sending a pulse into the earth below. The device beeped, the screen flickering. The technician frowned, adjusted a few settings, then tried again. This time, the beep was different. Sharper, faster. "We've got something," the man called out. James took a step forward. The scanner screen showed an outline, a structure buried deep beneath the surface, stretching far beyond the dimensions of the farmhouse, of the entire field itself. James stared at it. "That's not just a bunker." Marshall's jaw tightened. "No, it's not." The realization settled over James like a heavy weight. His father had lived his whole life knowing what was under this land. And now, James was about to uncover what he had spent decades protecting. But first, they had another battle to fight. That same afternoon, Marshall's legal team stormed through government archives, pulling records that had been buried for years. They sifted through layers of bureaucracy, hunting for proof that Project Falcon had never been officially abandoned. And they found it. A single document, its edges yellowed with time, marked with a faded but unmistakable government seal. It outlined the decommissioning of the site, but at the bottom, in small print, was a clause stating that the land was to remain under government interest in case of future necessity. It was exactly what they needed. But as they built their case, another discovery sent a chill down James's spine. Marshall's intelligence team had been digging into the developers who had stolen his land, following the money, tracing it back through shell companies and offshore accounts. And what they found confirmed James's worst fear. This wasn't just about real estate. The developers weren't just businessmen looking to turn profit. They were a front, an operation backed by foreign intelligence, designed to acquire land that, decades ago, had been home to one of the most classified projects in U.S. history. James clenched his fists as Marshall laid out the findings before him. "They knew," James said, his voice low, seething. "They knew exactly what they were after." Marshall nodded, and they almost got away with it. The next morning, James stepped into a courthouse for the first time in his life. The weight of the past weeks, of his father's legacy, of the fight he had been forced into, settled heavily on his shoulders. The developer's lawyers were waiting for him, polished, smug, wearing $1,000 suits. They spoke in measured, dismissive tones, as if this was all inevitable, as if James was just another foolish farmer clinging to something that no longer belonged to him. They presented their case methodically. They had a signed purchase agreement, the financial benefits their project would bring to the county, the legal precedent. They were certain they had already won. Then it was James's turn. He stood, clearing his throat, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You think you can buy everything with money," he said, looking directly at the lead attorney. "You think history, sacrifice, and service can be bulldozed and turned into profit?" The lawyer scoffed. "Mr. Holloway, with all due respect, you are a farmer. The land is no longer yours. Why fight a losing battle?" A slow murmur rippled through the room. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open. Colonel Richard Marshall entered, flanked by uniformed military officers, their presence sending a ripple of unease through the developer's legal team. Marshall carried a thick stack of documents, placing them firmly onto the judge's desk. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "these files prove that this land has been part of a protected military program for decades. Furthermore, Our investigation has revealed that the group attempting to seize it has direct ties to foreign intelligence. The judge's brow furrowed as he flipped through the papers, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. James turned back to the developer's attorney. "Still think I'm just a farmer?" The lawyer's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had nothing left to say. The judge cleared his throat. "Given the national security concerns presented here, I am granting an immediate injunction on this project." Relief surged through James so quickly he almost felt lightheaded. He had done it. The developers had lost. As the courtroom emptied, Marshall clapped a firm hand on James's shoulder. "This is a victory," he said. James nodded. He had won his land back. His father's legacy was safe. But deep down, he knew this fight wasn't over. Because beneath his feet, buried in the soil that had defined his family for generations, there was still a secret waiting to be uncovered. The fight for the land was over. The developers were gone. The court had ruled in James's favor, and his father's legacy remained intact. But as James stood at the edge of his field, staring out at the land that had been his home since birth, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Because the truth, the secret buried beneath his feet, was still waiting. The morning air was crisp as the military team arrived, their presence still feeling surreal. Engineers unloaded equipment, setting up in the exact spot where the scanners had detected something massive beneath the soil. James watched as they worked, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The ground had always been firm here, the grass growing unevenly, patches of exposed dirt breaking through where nothing ever seemed to take root. As a boy, he'd always assumed it was just an odd part of the land, a quirk of nature. But his father had always been careful around this spot, avoiding it when he could, never planting anything too deep. Looking at it now, James knew why. Marshall stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the ground. "It's here," he said. James nodded. "Yeah." A team of engineers knelt, brushing away the dirt. Within minutes, they uncovered something solid, metal, rusted but still intact. A few more sweeps of their hands, and the outline became clear. A hatch. James felt his chest tighten. His father had walked over this very spot for decades, knowing what lay beneath. And yet, he had never spoken a word of it. One of the engineers ran his fingers along the edge of the hatch, finding a recessed handle. He tried pulling it, but the metal barely budged, decades of rust and time sealing it shut. Another engineer stepped in with a crowbar, wedging it beneath the edge and straining against it. The metal groaned in protest. James exhaled, his pulse quickening. Marshall glanced at him. "You all right?" James nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Yeah." The crowbar slipped deeper into the crevice. With a sharp clang, the metal gave way, the hatch jerking open an inch. A rush of stale, frigid air escaped from below, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. James took a step forward, gripping the edge of the hatch, his knuckles white. The steel beneath his hands was rough, pitted with age, yet still sturdy, designed to last. Marshall nodded to the team. "Careful." The engineers pried the hatch open the rest of the way. The hinges groaned, rust flaking off as the metal door swung back, revealing a dark void beneath. A steel staircase descended into the depths. James stared into the blackness, his breath shallow. The opening gaped like the mouth of something ancient, something forgotten. The air seeping from below was thick, untouched by sunlight for decades. He swallowed hard. This was it. For years, his father had walked this land, carrying the weight of a secret he had never shared. Now, James was about to step into the past his father had buried. Marshall placed a flashlight in his hand. "Whenever you're ready." James tightened his grip around the handle, his thumb brushing over the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the first few steps of the steel staircase. Beyond that, the blackness remained unbroken. He took a deep breath. Then, gripping the railing, James Holloway took his first step down. A year had passed since James Holloway had stood in a courtroom and fought for his family's land. A year since he had uncovered the truth buried beneath his feet, since he had walked down that steel staircase, and stepped into a past he had never known existed. The farm was no longer just a farm. It was something more. Standing at the edge of the field, James watched as a group of men moved through the obstacle course, their boots kicking up dust, their bodies tensed with effort. These weren't soldiers preparing for war. They were men who had already fought their battles, who had returned home carrying scars the world couldn't always see. Project Falcon had been reborn, not as a classified military base, but as something just as important. A sanctuary, a place where veterans could rebuild themselves, where they could find a purpose beyond the battlefield. James had been skeptical when Marshall first proposed the idea. Turning the land into a recovery and rehabilitation center for former service members had sounded too ambitious, too big. But the more James thought about it, the more he realized it was exactly what this place was meant to be. His father had spent his life tending this land, protecting it. And now, in a way, it was still doing what it had always been meant to do, serving those who had given everything. James folded his arms as he watched a young Marine, Ethan, help another veteran over a wall in the training course. When Ethan had arrived 6 months ago, he barely spoke. His hands shook whenever he stood still for too long. But now, here he was running alongside his brothers, laughing as they pushed each other forward. James felt something tighten in his chest. His father would have liked this. Beyond the training grounds, near the far end of the property, the old bunker had been restored. The once rusted hatch had been cleaned, the underground facility reinforced. But instead of sealing it off, James had insisted it be turned into something else, a museum. A place where people could learn about what had been hidden for so long. His father's name was engraved at the entrance, a tribute to the man who had kept this land alive. A man James had spent his life trying to understand, only to realize too late just how much he had sacrificed. A rumble of an approaching vehicle broke James from his thoughts. He turned, watching as a military transport truck rolled down the dirt path toward him. The dust kicked up behind its tires as it came to a stop, the engine idling for a moment before the door swung open. An elderly man stepped out. James squinted, his brow furrowing as he took in the uniform, the rows of metals gleaming under the midday sun. He wasn't a stranger, not entirely. James had heard the name before, mentioned in whispers between his parents late at night, scribbled in the margins of old letters his mother had kept in a box beneath her bed. Brigadier General Thomas Holloway, his father's best friend. James felt his breath catch as the older man walked toward him with a slow, measured pace, his posture still straight despite the years etched into his face. His sharp, knowing eyes settled on James with something between approval and something deeper, recognition. "You must be James," the general said, his voice strong despite his age. James cleared his throat, nodding. "Yes, sir." The general studied him for a long moment before he finally spoke again. "Your father would have been proud of you, son." James's throat tightened. He had spent so much of his life wondering if he had ever truly lived up to the man his father had been, if he had done enough. Now, standing here, hearing those words from someone who had known his father better than anyone, it was the validation he never knew he needed. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. The general nodded. He always believed this land meant something more. "I'm glad you fought to keep it that way." James glanced back at the veterans' training, at the Bunker Turn Museum, at the sky stretching wide over the land he had almost lost. "It wasn't just about the land," he said. "It was about what it stood for." The general smiled, the deep lines in his face shifting. "And now, it stands for something even greater." The sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the farm. The wind moved through the fields, rustling the grass, carrying with it the echoes of the past. For the first time in a long time, James didn't feel the weight of it pressing down on him. This time, it felt like a promise fulfilled. James Holloway's story wasn't just about saving a farm. It wasn't just about a legal battle or an old military secret buried beneath his feet. It was about something far greater, the fight to protect what truly matters. Because in the end, it wasn't just his fight. It was a fight that echoed across generations, across families, across time itself. It was the fight of every person who had ever stood on the edge of losing something dear and refused to let it go. How many times had history been rewritten because someone decided to take a stand? How many homes, businesses, and legacies have been swallowed by greed because the world convinced people that their voice didn't matter? James had almost believed it too. He had almost walked away, almost let them take the land his father had fought to protect. He had been told that he was just a farmer, just one man standing in the way of progress, that he didn't have the power to change the inevitable. But history is made by the ones who refuse to back down. James didn't win because he had money. He didn't win because he had influence or power. He won because he was willing to fight. And in that fight, he found something far greater than just his home. He found purpose. And now, as he walked through the fields that had once been on the brink of destruction, as he watched veterans rebuild their lives on the very ground that had almost been lost, he knew one thing for certain. His father had been right. Holloways never back down. But this isn't just about James Holloway. It's about the countless people, past and present, who have fought for something they believed in. The small-town business owners standing against corporate buyouts. The families holding onto their homes despite developers circling like vultures. The men and women who refuse to let history be erased, who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to let go of what matters. And maybe you've been in that fight too. Maybe you stood in front of something that felt impossible, something that felt bigger than you, and you had to decide whether to let it go or fight like hell to keep it. Maybe you're still fighting. Never underestimate the value of your voice. Never believe the lie that you are too small to make a difference. Because the truth is, change, real, lasting change, doesn't start with governments or corporations. It starts with one person willing to stand their ground. One person who refuses to back down. If you've ever fought for something you believed in, share your story in the comments. Because this isn't just a place for stories, it's a place for people like you. If you believe in honoring memories, in standing strong when the world tells you to give up, in holding on to the things that truly matter, then this is your community. Hit subscribe. Be part of something bigger. Because the fight for what's right never truly ends. And together, we make sure that history never forgets the ones who stood their ground.